So not even a year after the first Gothic game, Piranha Bytes developed and released its sequel, Gothic 2. And to put it simply, Gothic 2 is to Gothic 1 what Baldur's Gate 2 and Fallout 2 are to Baldur's Gate and Fallout. Gothic 2 just took Gothic 1, continued the story excellently, made it many times bigger, made a bigger game world with dozens of more quests, plenty of new enemies, and improved on many of the mechanics from the first game. Gothic 2 uses the same mechanics from the first game. Not too much has changed. It's still very much the same unconventional, and some may even say archaic, control scheme. Pretty much the entire game is still controlled from the keyboard. The mouse still has very little to do with the game. Movements, attacks, looting, it's all very much controlled by the keys on the keyboard. But there are a few notable improvements to this system. For example, in the first game, in order to interact with anything, you had to push two buttons, usually Control and the up directional button. Whether it be looting, trading, or even simply talking to someone, you had to push both these buttons to do so. In Gothic 2, you merely have to push Control or even just left click with the mouse to do so. It's much less clunky, and I'd be lying if I said I missed having to push two buttons to do anything. Combat, though, requires two buttons still, which makes sense, though, as you can swing from multiple directions, so it only makes sense that you would push Control and then have to click the direction you want to attack from. And aside from that, combat has been pretty much unchanged. The only significant difference I noticed was the blocking ability. In the first game, it was a bit stiff and clunky, which made fights with human NPCs much harder. In Gothic 2, it's much improved. It even made fights with human NPCs that are way above your level survivable. Magic is also relatively unchanged, only it introduces some very big new features. Much like in the first game, depending on your choice and factions, you can learn limited magic or go full-blown mage and reach your full potential. To do so, you need to join the monastery. Once you do, you have to learn the circles of magic, and you can use any spell within the circles you've unlocked. Seems pretty similar to the first game, right? Well, here's the difference. You need the runes for each spell in order to cast them, much like in the first game, but in Gothic 2, you have to craft the runes. Each spell has a rune, and it has a list of ingredients you need in order to craft it. And not only that, you need to learn how to craft them from NPCs at the monastery. So not only do you have to have the necessary ingredients, including scarce blank rune stones and the corresponding scroll, you have to spend learning points in order to learn how to craft the runes. And it's not a spend once and you can craft them all kind of deal. Each spell has to be learned individually, and with not enough learning points for all of them, as well as any other skills you might want, you have to be careful which spells you take, or else you might end up playing yourself. As for learning points, that's also a mechanic that has been relatively unchanged. Each level you gain 10 learning points, and you spend these points on any skill or attribute you want to improve. The main difference here is that there are a few new skills added, and the mechanics for weapons proficiency has changed. In the first game, you would just spend learning points twice, and you'd be a master at one-handed sword fighting. But in Gothic 2, the weapons proficiencies are based on percentage. Each proficiency starts at 10%, and then you have to spend learning points in order to increase it. So you'd spend 10% to raise your one-handed to 20%, another 10 to raise it to 30%, and so on. and at some point the cost will double. You could end up having to spend around 12 levels worth of learning points to max out a single proficiency. With that and the skills you want, you once again have to consider carefully where to spend your points, or you could end up screwing yourself bad. Of course, the aforementioned rune crafting is one of those new skills, but so is alchemy and blacksmithing. With alchemy, you have a use for all the different herbs you pick up while exploring. You can craft simple healing potions, you can craft potions that increase your speed, and you can even craft potions that permanently increases one of your main attributes, which can help a lot with managing learning points. Blacksmithing can help with forging badass new weapons, and are much more cost-effective than buying weapons. And since you'll need that gold for many other things, that could be a big help. Though, once again, every individual potion or sword will require learning points to be able to craft. And once again, you can only spend these points by finding NPCs that can train you in these skills and attributes, just like in the first game. This provides the player with a good incentive to explore the world and talk to NPCs to see who can train you, and even pick up a few quests along the way, of which this game certainly has no shortage. The comparison to Baldur's Gate 2 and Fallout 2 is certainly an apt one. Much like those games, Gothic 2 is everything Gothic 1 was, just with a much bigger world, a much bigger story, and just so much more to do overall. It picks up right where the first one left off, as Zardes sends the protagonist to the city of Khorinis to obtain an artifact known as the Eye of Innos in order to fight an army of evil led by dragons. So, already, the story of Gothic 2 sounds much more conventional than the story of Gothic 1, where you eventually fight evil dragons and their minions. But even with the more conventional plot, Piranha Bytes still manages to make it fresh and keep it within the spirit of the first game, as your deeds from the first game have largely been forgotten, or at least everyone is ignorant of your role in them. And you're back to square one, as everyone won't give you the time of day unless you prove you're worth their time. They laugh at your warnings about dragons, and the guy you have to see about the Eye of Innos won't even allow you to see him until you show him that you're worth talking to, which you can only do by rising in the ranks of one of the three main factions in the game: the militia of Khorinis and the paladins of the king, mercenaries hired by the rebelling farmers, and the monastery of the fire mages. If you want to be a mage, you have to join the monastery. If you want to be a melee or archer character, then either the militia or paladins will suit you. And with many things being exclusive to each faction, it adds quite a bit of replayability to the game. Each faction has their own agendas and their own niches, and their own quest line and side quests. And aside from the factions, there's also dozens of side quests to do in the world of Khorinis. Many more than there was in Gothic 1, and they vary from helping farmers against mercenaries, hunting down bandits, attacking people and casting spells on them to make them forget the works. And there's not just a greater number of quests, but a much bigger world packed with them. The city of Khorinis and the forests and hills that surround it aren't as atmospheric as the valley from the first game, but it's no less beautiful. And neither is every single inch of it not as well designed or utilized. Everywhere there is a quest to do, NPCs to give you info and train you, or monsters to slaughter. And the Valley of Mines from the first game makes a comeback in Gothic 2, and I just gotta say, the Valley of Mines just might be one of my favorite settings or locations in any game. And visiting again actually has to be my favorite part of Gothic 2. It's just a trip through memory lane, seeing the state of it, meeting old characters, and it hasn't lost a single bit of its edge since the first game. Especially now that it's crawling with dragons and their minions. Speaking of which, dragon fights aren't as hard as they probably should be, which is probably one of my minor complaints about the game. But then again, once you get savvy enough at the game's mechanics and reach a certain level, many enemies that annihilated you before can be killed without breaking a sweat. That was the best thing about the first game, and that incredible sense of progression is just as present in its sequel. There's also an expansion for the game called Night of the Raven, which supposedly makes the game much harder and adds many new quests to the main area of the game. Though I wouldn't know, as I've only played the game with Night of the Raven. So I'm not exactly sure how the vanilla game was without it, but I do know that it adds stone tablets to the game, like little tablets that can increase your skills and attributes when you read them, which makes it easier on your learning points, though it does take learning points in order to learn how to read them, though. And I also know that it added a whole new area to the game called Jakandar, and aside from the Valley of Mines, it's my favorite area in the game. Its environments are incredibly diverse, and every one of them looks amazing. And it's got a great story of its own, and also has the best ambient soundtrack in the game. I'm not sure how Gothic 2 is without Night of the Raven, but with it, it's one hell of a game, and the expansion just adds more to love about it. Gothic 2 is just one of those perfect sequels in the vein of Baldur's Gate 2 and Fallout 2 that expands the world, offers more content, and perfectly continues the story of the original game, while still improving on many mechanics and keeping to the spirit of the original.